Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. We will just give it another 20 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Okay, I see quite a few people joining, so a formal welcome and good afternoon to this webinar. I'm David Gordon, I'm Research Director here at Planet Retail. Thank you for joining us today, where we're going to be looking at some of the major economic trends and the challenges, and hopefully some of the opportunities as well that are going to be emerging along the way. The topic, of course, is highly relevant and timely as the retail sector prepares for both peak trading and looks ahead to what we might expect to see in 2017. We're joined today by Planet Retail's Chief Economist, Boris Planer, and Retail Week's Executive Editor, George MacDonald. Boris, I'm sure you will have heard Boris in the past. He's an expert on macroeconomics and market trends and a regular speaker at global retail events. And George, he leads Retail Week's editorial content, and he's interviewed many of the biggest names in retail along the way as well. Now, for those of you not aware, Planet Retail and Retail Week are part of the same family, and we work together in ways that can add value to our subscribers and our customers. So today's webinar is the first in a series of engagements, and in March next year, Boris will also participate in Retail Week Live's event on the 8th and 9th of March. So we're going to begin with Boris and then move into a broader discussion. As we go through, please feed through questions using the questions box, and we'll endeavor to answer as many as we can. We're scheduled to run for the best part of an hour, but we'll keep an eye on time and we'll play that accordingly. But for the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, we'll pass over to Boris to get us started. So, Boris, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Much appreciated. So we're here to discuss the economic trends that are going to define retail in 2017, and then really try and have a discussion about what retailers can do about it. It's very easy to be negative about Brexit. There may be some opportunities as well for some businesses, and all of these are going to be topics of today's session. So, to start off, given an overview of what the broad situation is about Brexit, the first thing we can say, Britain's relationship with the EU remains largely unclear. That's half a year after the referendum, and we believe it's going to remain unclear for a while. Big questions that need to be clarified. So what about immigration control? How hard will the Brexit be? Will the UK remain a member of the EU single market or not? How hostile or friendly will the divorce be? What about the timing? Will everything be done in 2 years after Article 50 has been pressed, or is there need for an interim agreement? Because some people believe negotiating a proper agreement will take up to 10 years. Will the British government come under pressure as the inflationary wave arrives at the UK next year, and people get worried? So will the government reconsider options? Will there be new elections? Will there be a second referendum? It doesn't look like it at the moment, but this is all possible. And all those different scenarios, they imply very different realities for retail, and that's what we're here to talk about. So we expect a difficult 2017. We're going to look at forecasts in a bit, but for retailers now, 2017 will be over in no time, and for them the focus will be on limiting the long-term damage, because Brexit is not an event that strikes in 2017 or 2019, but it's a process that will develop over years, and there's a lot of instability in the global economy anyway, and retailers will have to deal with the wider challenges that come with it. So the game for retailers and suppliers over the next few years will be to compete who reacts best and fastest to a fast-changing scenario in a market that is not going to grow next year. So from a wider European angle, once the UK leaves the European Union, that's a blow to the UK and to the EU market as well. So the point here is that Brexit is mainly a problem for British companies, but it's a problem for export-oriented continental European companies as well. In terms of population, the EU following Brexit will be almost 13% smaller, but it'll be almost 19% smaller in terms of consumer spending, which can be a challenge for internationally oriented businesses. It's definitely an issue in the car industry, it's an issue in telecoms, It's an issue in the steel industry, perhaps, but it's also an issue for some FMCG businesses who really live, off their international sort of portfolio. And I can think of many German businesses, for example, that will be, directly affected should the UK sort of be more isolated going forward. The third broad development we would like to highlight is there's a risk on the inflation side and on the interest rate side for the UK. These are slightly connected stories, starting with the inflation, which again is related to the pound. The pound has lost over 17% of its external value against the dollar since the Brexit referendum on the 23rd of June, and almost 9% against the euro. And of course, the more dependent a business here in the UK is on imports, the more vulnerable it will be to a weak pound. We, in the wholesale price inflation, we see things changing already. The price of materials and fuels bought by UK manufacturers went up substantially in the summer. It's probably up 4% in August, up 7% in December. Something's building up here. And non-food suppliers, of course, will be difficult to substitute. After 30, 40 years of globalization, many clothing factories, many consumer electronics manufacturers are in Asia now. This stuff will continue to be imported, and we can clearly see some inflationary pressure building up in those areas, but also in food. Almost 40% of food, 39% of food sold in the UK is imported, mainly from the European Union. And the challenge for retailers there is to probably strengthen domestic sourcing over time. There's an opportunity to a certain extent to do that. We probably saw the first inflationary impulses this autumn. This Marmite Gate thing really brought wide attention to this, but we really expect a stronger impact in 2017. Currently, many retailers are hedging themselves against currency fluctuations. Many of those schemes will probably run out in 2017, and that's where we expect the real inflationary pressure to arrive at the UK. Now, for retailers, and that's one thing we're going to discuss with George here, the choice is either absorb the cost or increase prices. The latter, in an environment as we expected, is hardly going to be an option. So one question is, what can retailers in the UK do to still remain attractive to consumers who will come under increasing stress? Answers to stressed consumers will obviously come from the German discounters, Aldi and Lidl, and for them, Brexit and the weak pound is a historic opportunity to invest, accelerate expansion, and really sort of come to the rescue of the stressed middle class here. I'm sure we can discuss that further with George. And then in the next step, after inflation probably strikes from several sides in 2017, there's a risk that higher than expected inflation might force the Bank of England to increase interest rates, and that would then impact directly on the property market and have consequences for associated retail segments such as furniture retailing, consumer electronics retailing, and we're going to discuss all that. The next big topic for the food industry is the immigration issue. So the May government has so far made it clear it puts a higher priority on immigration control than on sort of free market access in to the European Union. So a shortage of unskilled labor, and we've already seen some Central Eastern European people leave the UK, that will hit traditional low-wage industries and their business models, and that includes retail, that includes manufacturing, food service, tourism, and agriculture. And all of them have benefited from Central European immigrants who now feel increasingly insecure and maybe partly shut out of the UK labor market going forward. And that has the potential to create disruption in business, as the industries have recognized. They've started to lobby very strongly for immigration to be possible on that level. However, in the long run, serious restriction to the free movement of labor might accelerate automation and manufacturing. That's one thing we're going to discuss here. Can that be part of the answer for retailers and manufacturers as they seek to control costs? Then, of course, there's significant implications for high-skilled labor about this whole immigration issue. So the finance industry, the City of London, insurance businesses, etc., they are heavily reliant on highly skilled talent from continental Europe, but that's sort of not directly affecting retail. Perhaps geographically, the biggest implications are in London, where 40% out of 8.6 million people are immigrants. So businesses are already lobbying very strongly for a soft Brexit. And that's, part of the big debate. There was a referendum. People voted for Brexit. But, one of the big sources of insecurity remains the fact that the current government in Downing Street seems to press for a hard Brexit, for which there is not necessarily a mandate, and businesses clearly prefer a soft Brexit, probably compromising slight restrictions on immigrations versus only slight restrictions on free market access to the European Union. But again, despite all the lobbying, which needs to continue, no one can guarantee any ideal outcomes, and the EU is not going to give the United Kingdom very easy negotiations, obviously, as it is eager to demonstrate that leaving the European Union is a bad idea, especially now with the wider situation that populist anti-European parties are coming close to power in a number of European countries. That's Germany, that's France, the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, Hungary, Poland, and of course the EU will do anything it can to avoid accelerated destabilization of its own society here. And then, on the financing level, there's risks involved for retailers and manufacturers. The broader situation is that, worried about losing access to the EU single market, and we know that under the term of passporting rights, a number of financial firms now contemplate the shift of resources to continental Europe. I read this morning that Lloyds is now, looking at a short list of 5 cities in continental Europe, and it might make an announcement in February, to move the first jobs. It's again, no one knows whether or not those passporting rights will be retained, but those financial businesses can't sit back. They need to make a decision now. And so there's Frankfurt in the race, Paris, Dublin, Amsterdam, even Warsaw, all applying for parts of those resources. And around 5,500 banks, insurance companies, other financial businesses would be directly affected by a loss of passporting rights. And the Japanese businesses, of course, are probably likely to pull out with all this insecurity. They invested heavily in the UK because they were attracted with the promise that the UK would serve as an entry point and gateway to the European financial markets. And if that cannot be guaranteed any longer, they are likely to pull out of the UK as well, probably in H1 2017. So the broader story here for retail and manufacturing is that there's a risk of the financial sector weakening, becoming less competitive, and that come to the detriment of investment and ultimately job creating, which will then sort of feed into the economy over time. So there's mutual interest and pragmatism. After all, there's a number of European businesses benefiting from passporting as well, but again, no one can guarantee any positive outcomes, and it's that very specific insecurity that's triggering the move around of resources. And that was the broad 5 trends we were bringing into play. Quick outlook at 2017, of course, which will be the most challenging year probably. So one thing we see happening is that risk-averse employers will try to manage costs in time of insecurity at the expense of salary increases and job creation. So salaries may be probably flat, probably close to flat next year, and that combined with high inflation is a risk for retailers. So the weak pound is going to drive inflation, and there's also risk of energy prices increasing. So OPEC is now sort of, we don't know how consistently they will pull through with their decisions, but oil production may be down, and political risk may be on the increase again. And 2017 could be the year when energy prices are back up steeply again, and this combined with the weak pound obviously adds up to considerable risk for consumer confidence and household spending. And then rising interest rates is another risk. We know the UK is a nation of home buyers as opposed to, say, Germany, which is a nation of people who rent a flat, and mortgages are often linked to key interest rates. So should the Bank of England finally rise interest rates either in the face of inflation or just to get out of this extended period of low interest policies, which actually sort of undermines pensions and has immense long-term risk associated with it. If either of that happens, then some mortgages of millions of homeowners in the UK could go up immediately, and again retailers would obviously feel the impact. So, and that insecurity on the side of consumers will affect consumer spending, and probably first on non-essential, deferrable items such as the furniture, the new TV, the fridge. That's probably food service is often one of the things where we see consumer behaviors change very quickly when a recession begins. People spend more time at home. We call it cocooning. And as part of that, actually, there's opportunities for supermarkets as people go out to have meals at restaurants less often and cook at home more often. And that's partly what happened in the recession of 2008, 2009. So, but in the face of those risks, retailers will, of course, review their supply chains, try and drive efficiencies, try to control costs, either soft or hard. Soft cost control would be avoiding salary increases. Hard would be cutting salaries. A soft control measure would be not employing more people. A hard measure would be layoffs, etc. And then we'll probably see more automation come in over time, although the immediate benefit of that is slightly doubtful. And we'll, of course, have a discussion with George about this as well. And for retailers, this means, and probably Brexit is just a small part of a long story. There was the credit crunch in 2008. There's a lot of instability in the global economy, in the financial markets, and the commodity markets. It's not just the Brexit, but for some period, we need to expect the economy to have its ups and downs, and retailers need to be prepared for all this. So probably finding a format that works in the good times and in the bad times will be part for the answer. And that really takes me to the end of my introductory part. So I'm glad we've got George McDonald here of Retail Week, and we can see the forecast that we made at Planet Retail, probably flat in nominal terms in 2017 and then modest recovery, but in real terms with the wave of inflation of perhaps 4 or 5% that we expect, that would be a considerable drop in real terms, and the drop will be even sharper on a per capita basis as the population in the UK continues to grow. Then we see slight recovery from 2018, but we see Brexit as a thing that will define retail long term. So by 2020, nominal retail sales will probably be 6% lower than they would have been under non-Brexit conditions under our country. So we're looking at a long-term challenge for retail, and I know George McDonald, who's sitting here with us, he speaks to retailers in the UK all the time. And what do you pick up from the retail industry in the UK? What's the view?
Well, I think there is a great deal of uncertainty about what the implications of Brexit will be, because we talk about it as if it's happened, but of course it hasn't. We wait for Article 50 to be triggered. So retailers are looking in their crystal balls and trying to work out how the shopper will behave. Despite the fact that we had the poll and there was a big fall in consumer confidence not long afterwards, in fact, things have held up pretty well this year. There was a lot of talk that people would instantly rein in their spending. That hasn't really happened. And the Brexit vote and how it plays out are occurring in a landscape that's really been shifting fast. Everything from the rise of multi-channel shopping to various other cost pressures that are on the that have come and will grow, such as wages, but equally the disruptive effect of technology. Brexit is one more challenge for the retailers, but I think having come through the financial crisis and emerged stronger as an industry following the disappearance of some of the weaker players, they will have some good ideas about what they can do. There are practical measures that they can take, whether it's looking at their supply bases, where they're sourcing from, how they actually build their businesses, what can they do on costs on prices, to avoid passing those on to the shopper. There'll be a lot of thinking going on, and I think it's too early to behave as if the only possible outcome can be that it is a disaster for Britain and for retailers. I think there could be many twists in this tale yet. But undoubted impact. You can see that in what's happened to many retailers' share prices since the vote. There's a lot of nervousness. And you can see it too in the way in which the decline in the value of sterling has affected people. There is, as you mentioned, increasing conversation going on about the extent to which prices can be risen. I think there'll be more argy-bargy between retailers and suppliers about who should bear those extra costs, or the extent to which those costs actually can be mitigated. And we've seen, for instance, in the example of Sports Direct, where failure to be properly hedged has really hit them. But there is a bit of a feeling among some in the city, actually, that the horror is overdone. Maybe retailers are a little bit better prepared than they're being given credit for, and some of the mood music is more reassuring than it sounds. But I think in summary, having come through the financial crisis a few years back, they've got some new ways of thinking that they learned then, new practical lessons, and so they'll be thinking ahead, thinking what can we do right across the business to make sure that we come through this as smoothly as possible.
Well, thanks to both Boris and George there for those opening comments. Straight away, we've had some questions coming in, and Boris paints some challenges ahead, whereas George has, I think, rightly sort of pointed out to the resilience so far of the retail sector. Although one question that has come in, George, is that you mentioned there the disappearance of some of the weaker retailers. Do you see any further casualties in the near future?
I think that's certainly possible. However, I don't think those will be casualties that arise as a result of Brexit. I think they will arise from fundamental retail proposition problems or things like structures of financing. It's certainly possible, but at the moment I wouldn't envisage anything like what we saw during the recession as a result of Brexit. One of the results of Brexit was that strong companies came through it. So you can look at that in two ways. You can say, you've got all these very strong businesses adept at adapting, or equally you might say, actually, most of the weaker ones have gone. So therefore, this is a real tooth and claw fight for market share now, and maybe there could be some big casualties.
Yeah, and Boris?
Yes, a question from me actually for George about potential casualties. So the UK is one of the world's most advanced markets as far as e-commerce is concerned. So we saw Tesco go live with its online offer in the early 2000s, and Clubcard, Nectarcard went live at the time, this data mining thing. And I'm from Germany, and if I come to the UK and look at retail here, it's far more advanced. But then again, we know that probably a third of British online sales go to customers abroad. Many of them sit in the European Union, and the European Union is building on this thing called the single digital area, to which the UK, in the case of a hard Brexit, could lose access. And there's all this investment coming into British retail from the financial industry into the online sector. Do you see anyone under threat there, or what's the?
I don't think so. I think there's actually genuine opportunity really there. I do think a lot of UK companies are pretty advanced on online. We've got fantastic businesses like ASOS, growing businesses like Boohoo. Shop Direct has reinvented itself, and there are a lot of opportunities because it's I take the point. Who wants business to become harder? Nobody. And I've got not the slightest doubt in some ways it will become harder as a result of Brexit. But online retailers are already trading in all sorts of other countries around the world. You know, China, you look at some of the names that are working with Alibaba there, whether it's Marks and Spencer or Sainsbury's. And actually there are opportunities not just for the e-tailers, but for really good businesses to open shops elsewhere. To go back to the recession and, you know, finding opportunities when times are tough. You had businesses like Ted Baker that, you know, grew their international operations during the recession, and it wasn't just in EU countries. You know, Ted Baker, for instance, got quite a substantial business now in the United States. So, you know, anything that makes things more complex or more costly is unwelcome. But you know, I don't think cursors will stop moving over the buy button on British retailers' websites in European countries as a result of Brexit.
So, I mean, again, some good opinions coming in from both of you. I mean, we're very focused at the moment on Christmas trading in the next couple of weeks, but maybe just to drill down a little bit into some more detail. What do you think January, February, March is going to look like for UK retail? I mean, traditionally, you know, quite a tough trading period, and with you know, some of the challenges potentially facing consumers, as Boris has identified. George, how do you think the next 3 months will play out on UK retail?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see because, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about how Christmas will play out, and to an extent that will affect how the early part of the year plays out. So on the one hand, there's those who fear that shoppers will be thinking to themselves, oh, is this going to be the last cheap Christmas? Is everything going to go up next year? So I'm going to buy everything now and then, you know, snap my purse shut. Or you know, is it basically going to be much more like business as usual? Because there's lots of things that we buy that we are still going to need to buy, whatever month of the year it is. Obviously, January, February can be quieter times for retailers of various types, and that might make it a bit more difficult to read whether there's any sort of immediate change in consumer behavior. But so far, there doesn't seem to have been any change in shopper behavior since the vote. You know, despite falls in confidence, that has not been reflected in retail sales.
And could it be possible that probably a decline in domestic consumer confidence has been covered up by increasing tourism into the UK since the pound's been weak? What's your view on that?
Actually, it's a really interesting point that I would have mentioned actually later if you hadn't already brought it up. I think this is very interesting. The decline in the value of the pound has already led to some very strong sales by, for instance, luxury retailers in London's West End, but also, you know, we've got lots of shoppers coming from countries like China who love to go to Bicester Village, places like this. You know, that in its own right could help British retailers, and it's sometimes misunderstood the extent to which foreign visitors go beyond London. So, for instance, we have lots of students from overseas, so all sorts of university towns actually draw foreign shoppers, and you know they'll be keen. Should it, you know, should sterling still be low, they will be keen to pick up bargains here. And then the reverse side of the coin actually is it creates familiarity with retail brands, which can actually help pave the way for building business overseas.
So, George, I was going to say, I mean, you make a good case for continuing consumer demand in the months ahead, and you know, whilst Boris argues that there may be some challenges, you feel that the UK consumer could be quite resilient over the months ahead. But I think undoubtedly there's going to be some supply chain pressures on UK retailers. The devaluation of the pound is clearly going to have an impact in terms of supply prices coming through the chain. be really interested to get your views, and we have had one or two questions of this type coming in on your views in terms of what retailers need to be doing to prepare for that rise in input prices, and whether that may or may not accelerate the level of technology that we are seeing within the retail supply chain. So quite a bit to go at there, George, but maybe just give us a sense of your initial views.
Yeah, fair points. Whether it's food or fashion, the reality is we're probably going to see some price rises, and so the question is to what extent can those be dealt with, and how? Many of the retailers have been quite clear that they are unwilling to pass on. In some cases, they won't pass on at all to the shopper extra costs, they say. In other cases, they say they will pass on as little as possible, and that they will make sure that they offer the lowest price if that's what they're known for now. So they're going to be keen to do that. So I think there will potentially be a bit more push and shove between retailers and suppliers, as we've already seen over things like Marmite Gate. I think the retailers will be saying, actually, if you cannot really justify these price rises, we're not going to take them. If a price rise really is justifiable, then I think the retailers will either take a hit themselves in some cases, or they'll put the price up by as little as they can. But what retailers will not accept from suppliers is we're putting all of our prices of all of our products up by X%. I think the retailers will come back and say, hang on 1 minute, okay, I see why maybe this one has gone up X%. How can we work with you to make sure that doesn't cost the customer that much? But we're not accepting X% on this because we simply don't believe that that's the genuine change in cost that we should be charged. And Tesco, Dixons, to name but two companies, very publicly said, we're going to pass on as little as possible, if any.
And thanks for those comments, George. And it's a fairly complex picture anyway, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, there's three parties that can absorb part of the cost increases. That's the retailers, that's the suppliers, that's the consumer. And how much of that can be taken by the consumer really depends on the wider environment. It depends on where the oil prices go in, where interest rates are going to be this time next year. So for retailers, I think it's going to be about testing how much of a price increase consumers are willing to put on their shoulders.
So, I mean, in terms of the broader sort of question around, so what should retailers be doing to prepare, or what evidence have you seen recently, George, of retailers preparing for the year ahead in that respect?
Yeah. So actually, just to go back to the final point of your last question, which I actually think leads quite nicely into this. I think you asked whether there would be accelerated technological change. Yes. I think there will be, and I think people will be looking at how technology can help them take cost out of business, so greater automation and that sort of thing. But the other interesting thing, and this has got nothing to do with Brexit, it's been happening for a few years, but like other difficult issues retailers confronting, Brexit might accelerate it. Technology has transformed retail over the last few years. In many cases, the technology being used by consumers, like smartphones. So I think smart retailers will be actually thinking, how do we respond through technology? And actually, how should we be investing more in technology? Because again, to go back to the recession, very interesting thing, some of the winners said, actually, what we're not going to do at the moment is focus on cost cutting. Okay, let's assume keeping a tight lid on costs is a good thing. It's not like they were going to be extravagant. But they actually said to them, it's not about cost. It's about how do we create a business that is going to appeal better to our shoppers. So take the example of John Lewis. It invested during the recession, and funnily enough, it's investing again now, and quite a lot of that investment is going into technology.
Yeah, the old adage of you can't save your way to growth is probably never more relevant. I mean, are there examples of recently in terms of I guess actions being taken by retailers that you particularly applaud? I mean, you mentioned John Lewis. Are there others that you've seen kind of taking the right stance in terms of addressing the challenges full on and in the right way, as you say?
Well, I think in a perverse sort of way, because of the uncertainty that Brexit is creating, it's really prompted people to have a good look at their businesses and think, how well set up are we if we hit turbulence? And really that's just a way of asking the question, how good is our proposition really? Have we got a good proposition fundamentally? But if you think of some of the things that that people can do, what persuades any shopper to part with money? Okay, maybe essential, so we all need to eat. However, as we know, lots of retailers are not selling essentials. So what is going to make a difference to the customer is things like uniqueness of product, quality of product. Sorry, by uniqueness I mean exclusivity. You can't get it anywhere else, and it is something worth having. I think people will look at their financing. One of the issues in the recession was very problematic financial structures, and I'm sure people will be looking at that. But really, it's going back and thinking, are we really doing something that is going to make people excited and want to spend money with us, even with essentials like food?
I mean, interestingly, we just had a question that says, whether prices rise or not, do you think brands will be looking to increase their customer experience to keep shoppers interested in their products? And I think you have pretty much just answered that, saying actually, the way to growth is through differentiation and investment in terms of actually keeping that relationship with the customer extremely tight.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I know, I hope I'm not sounding too glib, because it sounds so easy to say, have you got a great proposition, etc. But I genuinely think that's the sort of question you have to be asking yourself, and then the retailers will know better than me how to really work out whether they've got it right.
And I think this experience factor is really important to mention, because we know it's more important to the young generation, the millennials, who are sort of setting up their own households, earning their own income now, and for them experience is more important than consumption. That probably differentiates them from previous generations, and in that sense it's important to know that a fashion retailer A does not only compete with fashion retailer B, but also with the cinema, with tourism, and all this whole experience industry. So rather than saving, investing in that differentiation factor is going to be very important. And we need to remember that it's not just about the challenges in 2017, but that pressure on the middle class, the instability in the world economy, retailers, the challenges aren't over in 2017. So that's a good time to think about long-term positioning.
I think you just made an absolutely great point there, which is about the rise of things like leisure, because it's been a bit of a trend for a year or two. So again, okay, yes, we'd rather Brexit wasn't happening, but there are great big seismic shifts occurring, such as what seems at present this move towards spending on leisure and experience rather than stuff. So Brexit is yet one other factor that retailers are thinking about.
Great. Okay. Well, look, we've covered off one or two of the sort of supply factors and some of the demand questions. A complete change of tact now, and a great question come in. How do you think the government's industrial strategy might impact the retail sector? So maybe I'll go to Boris first. I mean, the UK government's industrial strategy. Do we have a plan yet? What's your view on this as an outsider looking in?
Yeah, as an outsider looking in, I see strange things going on behind closed doors. Apparently, the government promising attractive conditions to the car industry just to make sure they remain committed to the UK, keep their plants there. I see a world famous fast food chain transferring their headquarters for foreign operations from Luxembourg to the UK for tax reasons. None of this is probably sustainable, but a proper industrial policy is going to be crucial for the UK as a country, for its people, for retail, because we must remember that Brexit, the average Briton is not a xenophobic person that hates Europe, but I tend to see the Brexit vote as an anti-globalization vote of people who weren't hurt enough by politics, and with many manufacturing jobs going to China in clothing and consumer electronics in the 1980s, 1990s, now automation affecting middle-class jobs of a strata of people who can articulate themselves. People are worried about their future, and it's always cheap. That's a complex question, but it's always cheaper to sort of have goods imported from China. But if that means people at home haven't got enough jobs, the big challenge for the government in the UK and actually across the EU and in America is to find an answer to that. And industrial policy is going to be a huge topic in the coming years, and obviously with very direct impact on retail.
And George, I mean, how do you think the next sort of few months might play out, in terms of the government's interaction and how that will impact the retail sector?
I wish I knew the answer. We're just about to come into Christmas. Anecdotally, I think it's gone at least okay. Maybe it's gone in some cases a bit better than was feared. So although we've got these clouds of uncertainty on the horizon, the economy has not fallen off a cliff. But you think of some of the things that maybe do need to happen, that I think will stand us in good stead. And I don't know whether this is industrial policy or tech policy or something else, but there was the report the other day about which countries were best set up with, I can't remember if it was 4G or 5G. Anyway, the point was the UK was behind, is already behind countries ranging from, I think Peru was one, Albania was another. We've got to ensure we've got connectivity, and at the moment we haven't got enough. And to go back to early points about technology, to make the most of that technology, if you're a retailer, the consumer needs to be able to get on their smartphone.
Yeah, and I mean it's quite apt. We have a sort of 2 or 3 questions on technology actually, in terms of, so it's quite apt that you bring the conversation back round to technology, and I think, I mean, that leads me into perhaps back to the online discussion again, and I sense retailers are really wrestling with trying to run both a bricks and mortar operation as well as running an online fulfillment operation, and further sort of external pressures are just simply adding to the difficulties that retailers have of returning a reasonable sort of profitability. I mean, it'd just be interesting, again, George, and maybe Boris, just to get your views on this sort of double running that retailers are having to do at the moment, and how you might see this all playing out from a profitability perspective, given the backdrop of Brexit, a falling pound, rising costs. Where's the end game?
Yeah, good question. Now, this is something, though, that again has been going on for years. There's always been these questions of where does the profitability really lie? Are certain operations really profitable at all, or are they being held up by another part of the business? However, I think that because there are all these various pressures have come to bear on retail in the last few years, even before the Brexit vote. There's been a great focus on productivity. A lot of retailers are looking at it in real depth. But to go back specifically to online and bricks and mortar, I think it was last year various retailers actually started charging, in some cases, dependent on the value of an order. There was a realism that this is costing something, and funnily enough, actually, we haven't heard stories since of people saying, "Oh no, I don't want that service anymore." They seem to have accepted that cost to an extent. Are you really providing value? And so the consumers presumably thought, "I value this enough. I wish it was still nothing, but actually I value it enough. I don't mind spending $5 or whatever it may be."
Yeah.
And just one last point on that. Again, I know some of the things I'd say might be really easy to say and much harder to do, but there's a lot more opportunity probably to be had in things like additional sales and cross-selling to the customer who comes in to collect an order in store. So there are things that can be done. Maybe they're little things, but together they may add up to something worth having.
Yeah. No. I mean, all good points, George. And I'm conscious of time, and we've still got some more questions coming in. So I'm just going to move us on a little bit. Both of you, sort of separately on different points, have referred to the last recession from 2008, and I just wonder if there are some lessons to be had from that. If we take perhaps Boris's more challenging outlook of a consumer under pressure, disposable incomes dropping, inflation rising. If we take that sort of scenario, are there lessons from the period that we went through in 2008, 2009 on how businesses rode out that last recession that perhaps we haven't mentioned already that we can take from that period into 2017? I'm looking at Boris. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's been a while, and obviously I was looking at all this from a foreign angle, but the big thing that sticks to my mind from the credit crunch in 2008 and 2009 was that some supermarkets were winners of this, and some discount stores, and it didn't surprise us when we saw it. The discounters were winners because the stigma of being seen walking around the city with an Aldi bag in your hand, that finally got broken. Aldi and Lidl became accepted by the middle class, actually doing Aldi discounter parties with Aldi champagne became fashionable. The papers were sort of full of feuilletonistic stories about how people were venturing in a new area and making first contact and finding out great value for money, and they stick to this. And we see the discounters growing very dynamically. And again, as we mentioned before, the weak pound is now providing a historic opportunity for foreign retailers, including the German discounters, to invest, especially if the whole situation of insecurity remains. Then that historic window of opportunity will remain open for a very long time. And that's one of the things that the government, of course, will need to look at. Yeah. And the other thing we saw is that people, as they usually do in a recession, stopped going out for meals almost immediately, cooked more at home, and for foreign supermarkets offering attractive fresh food ranges and featuring sort of convenience foods, ready meals that were actually fairly premium, freshly launched by Tesco, Sainsbury's at the time, as good as in a restaurant, but significantly cheaper. All those things were successes. So, and that is a classic example in the history of economy, how industry segments can find opportunities and actually benefit and grow even in a shrinking niche.
Are you seeing similar lessons, George?
Well, just picking up on where Boris left off there, I think one thing, and we talked a moment ago about bricks and mortar. Who knows what the role of the bricks and mortar shop will be far into the future, but it's still a popular place for consumers to go. One thing that happened in the last recession, and to your point about there are opportunities, the grocers grew their convenience businesses quite strongly there, and one of the things that helped them was lower property costs as a result of the recession. So there were silver linings in those clouds. It's interesting talking about the discounters, because obviously they make quite a big deal now of the provenance of some of their food, i.e. the British provenance. And one question here that I think you talked about, but we haven't gone into in so much detail, is something like food. We can't, the UK can't grow all its own food. It is going to need to carry on importing, but it does make you think, actually, should we be growing more? Do we need an agricultural policy as well as an industrial policy and a technological policy?
And one interesting aspect, again, about the growth of discounters in a recession and sourcing at a time of a weak currency, what I find interesting is that with a smaller product range, discounters can substitute imports with local products, just 100 items, and probably substitute 15% of the sales just doing that, which means they can adapt more easily and are probably less exposed to other grocers when it comes to weak currencies, and certainly they are less exposed than hypermarkets who have those huge non-food ranges, which are definitely still going to come and even be purchased in dollars. And we saw earlier that the pound has devaluated against the dollar much more strongly than it has against the euro.
Just a couple of really brief things about the discounters. I don't know what the answers are, or what the complete implications will be of what I was saying. They are in a completely different place from where they were during the recession. They've grown a great deal since. And okay, yes, they do have more limited ranges, but actually the ranges have been getting much bigger than they used to be. They've been closing the gap with what you might call the establishment grocers. So you wonder, actually, let's say there is turbulence, is there really the same opportunity for them again, or have they actually, they're growing great, still growing, but was there a big opportunity then? Was that their moment? And then the other thing, actually, there's been a bit of comment that certain really important products, don't hold me to this, but I think milk and bananas have both been mentioned. You're actually seeing them actually at the same prices in the discounters as the big four. So, is the distinction starting to come to an end? Don't know the answer, but it will be interesting to see that battle play out.
So, yeah, I mean, you mentioned if turbulence happens, it's certainly, I guess, an open book at the moment in terms of exactly what's going to play out in 2017. I've got an eye on time, and I just want to perhaps give both of you an opportunity just to make any last sort of remaining comments, or just really a couple of summary points from each of you in terms of the year ahead. So we've got we've had some a great input from Boris there, giving his overview. Those slides will be available. I see that was a question that was asked of me. Those slides will be available, but as we just begin to wind down this webinar, and thank you very much for being part of it, Boris, have you got a kind of a final overarching view of the year ahead and the economic trends that this might mean for retailers?
Yes, I think I do. I think 2017 is going to be a tough year for retail. It is, because it's going to be a tough year for consumers, but it's not going to be the end of the world, and especially in grocery retail, there will be opportunities. There will be opportunities in non-food retail, as George has mentioned, from more tourists coming in, making first contact with British brands. And I then expect gradual recovery from 2018, probably another slight drop as Brexit actually happens, and probably in 2020, we don't know quite sure. But the thing is, as George has also pointed out rightly, Brexit is just a small chapter in a big fat book of challenges that started 10 years ago with the credit crunch, and that's going to continue for quite a while. So I'm thinking of an aging society, of the middle class crunch, of the instability that's deeply embedded in the global financial and the commodity markets. There will always be challenges, and there's technological progress which will keep disrupting the industry. So 2017 will be all eyes on Brexit, and the insecurity. Yes, we don't know if there's going to be trouble, but the fact that we don't know, that itself creates problems, because that means weak pound, that means high inflation. But 2017 will be over at some point, but most challenges will still be there.
George?
Yeah, no, not too much I would add, I don't think. I would say, no matter how people voted, or not everyone may be British, but any Brits listening, it doesn't matter how you voted, we are where we are. And so we need to approach Brexit thinking, what action can you take to protect yourself and ideally build your business? Because whether the effect is good, bad, or indifferent, you certainly won't get anywhere by wringing your hands about the result of the vote.
Gentlemen, excellent. Thank you very much for your contributions today. As I said at the beginning, this is just one in a series of collaborations working towards Retail Week Live, which is on the 8th and 9th of March. Boris, again, and George will be taking forward their discussions into that event. For now, we're going to close this webinar. Planet Retail has a full series of webinars available going forward into 2017, so we'll continue to monitor this topic and many others as well. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your questions, and we look forward to being with you again in the near future.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.